Hi everyone, I'm going to apologize in advance. Last night I had an asthma attack and an allergy attack at the same time, and my lungs are trying to convince us all that they still work. It's not going great. So if I have to stop and take a bite of banana or drink water, bear with me. This is our roadmap for where we're going right now. It actually pairs really well with the talk we just heard. And so the principle is public records requests, government records requests, what can you ask for, what can you do with it, and how can it support interdisciplinary work, not just within law and policy, obviously that's my passion, but beyond that. So the data that you can ask for, it's really jurisdictionally specific. In the US, we have the Freedom of Information Act. Every state has its own sunshine laws. Canada has the same. I took a look and I saw Finland does as well on the active openness of government activities. And so for the different systems of government that you're working with, think about what you want from those particular systems. So I live in a state called Ohio. Ohio is a tragic state in the sense that it's very heavy in animal ag, but it also has really distinct urban centers as well. And so it's a really good microscope to really dive down into what you can ask for, how it matters, and the socioeconomic impacts of those factions. So when I started this project, I started to think about, I started to think about how quick I would get what information I wanted. And so I did all my Freedom of Information Act requests first because I'm never going to get them back. That's a joke for all of the other lawyers in the room. You're never going to get them back. Next, I did the Attorney General's offices because they have really specific corporate oversight and consumer protection divisions that let you look into large-scale puppy mills. Ohio is huge in large-scale puppy mills. We have a community, it's called the Amish community. They view cats and dogs. Depending on your worldview, this makes sense. They view cats and dogs as very similar to other farmed animal. They think effectively you can CAFO cats and dogs, which, well, at least it's very equal of them. And so there is a huge issue with puppy mills in Ohio. So I was able to pull all of the corporate oversight and civil complaints against people complaining that they bought a puppy, it was really sick, it had parvo, they died. And then you look and wow, there's 12 others from this single property. Then we dove a little deeper, more local. In Ohio, there is a specific law that I'm not sure exists in many other places that allows humane societies themselves to deputize agents that can then go and enforce the anti-cruelty laws in the state, which is really cool, depending. And that makes every humane society that has deputized agents a branch of the government to that extent, which means you can do public records requests to those humane societies. So I was able to ask for all of the investigation charging plea documents for every animal cruelty instance that happened in the state of Ohio for 3 years. I decided to go from 2020, because that was COVID happened, that's a whole new time period for us, onward. And what we found were some wild things. So if you decide to take this upon yourself, this is my dog Betty. Hi Betty. Breathe, for one thing, because when you do start getting your requests back, it's going to seem like a lot, especially if you're dealing with counties that do a really good job of investigating. If they're doing a really good job of investigating, there's going to be a lot of data that you're going to get. So one of the counties that I looked at was Cuyahoga County. It has a major urban center, Cleveland, and within this major urban center, there's a huge drug problem. And what we found, there's huge dogfighting problems. But no one's actually going for the dogfighting busts. Every dogfighting bust we found is attached to a drug bust. As part of these drug busts, they were finding that there's human trafficking going on, there's child endangerment. So we were able to start piecing together how crime itself is impacting animal cruelty and human cruelty that's happening in those regions. We were also able to test really specific hypotheses about animal cruelty that there were a few studies that came out and everyone just kind of believed them. And by doing this, we can test it. And one of those was that there's increased domestic violence in slaughterhouse communities. The link between domestic violence and animal cruelty is really well established. I'm not challenging that. I found that as well. However, there was a really specific study that came out some years ago when I was at the Animal Legal Defense Fund that looked into whether there is increased domestic violence and companion animal cruelty in areas that had slaughterhouses. The idea being there's people that are abusing animals all day. They have to be brutal to animals. They're killing them. We all know what goes on. And then they're going home and they have no psychological support. And then the assumption that they were then finding it acceptable to beat their dogs, cats, and or human families. I didn't find that. It was confusing because I fully went in expecting to prove this hypothesis. I had the data. There's so many slaughterhouses in Ohio. I was going to have another study that was going to prove it. I didn't find that at all. What I found was in communities with slaughterhouses, there was less domestic violence and less animal cruelty. But I have no idea where we are with the slides now. We're just flying by the seat of our pants here. Communities that had prisons in Ohio, so the people that are living in these communities are not the prisoners, they're in jail. But the people who would make up these communities are people who probably work in the prisons. There was an extreme amount of domestic violence in those communities. There was an extreme amount of animal cruelty. And so to take a look at this, I had to have the communities that we were looking at that had either slaughterhouses, prisons, whatever, and then a control county. So a county of a similar population and a similar demographic to make sure that they were fair comparisons to make. And what we found was prisons and communities with large-scale prisons, particularly private prisons, which is a whole other conversation, had such extraordinary numbers of domestic violence and animal cruelty as to not be just par for the course. So by doing this, and I took a really big view of it, not just companion animal cruelty, but looking at the different economies of animals and how they impact cruelty to get an actual holistic picture of the landscape of what cruel actions impact animals in Ohio, boiled down to animal cruelty. And so we were looking at the socioeconomic factors. One of the students that I was working with noticed that when middle-aged people, sorry dudes, almost all as men, commit their first act of animal cruelty in their midlife, so between 30s and 40s, say they have no record prior to that, suddenly out of the blue they're getting hauled in for animal cruelty. Almost every instance of that we found, they had a severe economic hardship 6 months to a year before. So these were often evictions, foreclosures, things that would have materially changed their life and their sense of self would down the line we found lead to animal cruelty and at times after that domestic violence as well. So it invites this discussion of, is there an economic component to the link between domestic violence and animal cruelty? If there's an economic component, maybe there's policy that we can do that will help alleviate that. There's also regional specific issues that we've touched on a little bit with the Amish puppy mills, the economies, that's the gambling, dog fighting, all of that good stuff, not good stuff. Existing hypotheses and data making. So you get all of this stuff. What the heck do you do with it? And that was a principal question that I had because I was getting really interesting segments of what animal cruelty looks like in Ohio, but not just illegal cruelty, legal cruelty as well. So within our state, there is a public university. This public university operates what I can only describe as an absolute horror show of a quote-unquote experimental meat research facility where they do horrific things to cows. And in my mind, that's cruelty. So we went back to our FOIAs and we were looking at what we requested. And luckily, we requested inspection reports for every facility that is involved in any kind of animal testing, up to and including animal agriculture testing. And so we're taking all of this, commonplace animal cruelty, somebody beats a dog or a cat, high-level animal cruelty, what puppy mills are failing inspections, what animal agricultural institutions are failing inspections, and then down to the public universities and experimental places of where are they failing inspections. And now what the heck do we do with all of this data? It is so much more than you want. So we'll get into that a little bit, put a pin in the visual, but start to think as we go forward a little bit, what would a visual representation of this look like? How do you map cruelty, especially when it has so many different facets? And I would love all of your advice because I have not perfected this by any measure. And so we had our initial data and we're like, all right, let's go deeper. What more can we think? But keep in mind the base assumptions that we have of people and things that are going to color our qualitative findings. So I have to make assumptions. They're not correct. They're my assumptions on my understanding of the universe. They're not anybody else's in this place. So how do you also control for your own fundamental base assumptions on people and our behavior? So we looked at prior offenders. We had one individual who had just gotten arrested for being in an enormous drug bust. It was like a comical number of counts of drugs and dog fighting, and it was just the docket sheet was like 400 offenses. And so we pulled back. How many times has this person been arrested previously? And she was always arrested with her partner. And her partner had a far longer rap sheet than she did. And we came to find out that she was likely a human trafficked person who got stuck in a situation. And so looking deeper, where did all of these first instances come from? And how did that cruelty branch out into other parts of their life? How did their socioeconomic status, their history, impact what was happening to them in that moment? Economic causes, we've talked a little bit about that. Humane and eco-washing, it's my passion. Humane washing is my passion. I'm a boring person. But one of the cases that I had was a Consumer Sales Protection Act case, for example, against a gentleman who was portraying himself as a small-scale dog breeder. He breeds these cute little corgis in his backyard. No, he only has one breed a year, of course. Like, he's a completely normal, great guy. Come to find out, he was a prolific broker of many Amish puppy mill breeders. And so he was buying all of these dogs and puppies from the Amish puppy mills and then selling them to people as though he bred them on his property. And he was lying so comically that at one point, because of all my lawsuits against him, he changed his name in advertisements, which I thought was great. I was like, I can still find you. You're on the same property. And so these data, though, led to those cases, because once you have the Attorney General complaints, you can find plaintiffs. And if you have a cause of action and you have a plaintiff, maybe you can get somewhere, at least in the US. And then we also looked at enforcement effectiveness. So part of the Humane Society records that we received really led to the question of, can rural communities adequately enforce anti-cruelty laws? Can the government, the Attorney General's office, actually enforce corporate oversight laws? And is there a resource issue driving enforcement? We found a county that was really confusing. It would seize a bunch of dogs, like 12 dogs at a time, and then dismiss the charges against the person. They wouldn't require them. They wouldn't show up for their bond hearing, and then they would dismiss, but they'd keep the dogs. And so I was wondering what was happening there. It's really confusing. Or they'd get like a $20 fine. And so the question is, does the court not have the ability to enforce? Are they just not interested in enforcement of anti-cruelty? And it turned out that almost all of these were repeat offenses. So we went back, and they would just routinely go out to these properties, seize a bunch of dogs, send the dogs to the pound, adopt out the dogs, and then dismiss the charges. And finding those enforcement holes and what's driving those enforcement holes was really important. So, I hope you've had time to think about it with me yelling at you. What does a data map look like for something like this? I wanted a really literal interactive map, and my husband works in IT, and he's like, I can develop this for you, I've got this. And to his credit, he's still working on it. It's actually coming along really well. But I want to go bigger than that, because I think we're bigger than that. Everyone in this room, we're all working on something where data will help us do what we're trying to do or learn what we're trying to learn. So I want to go more. So I opened up, I was like, hey husband, I know you're busy. How about a searchable relational database where we can plug in what we're looking for, what our research set is, and find data that will collaborate or corroborate what we're looking at? And he's like, do you still want the map? And I said, yes, I still want the map. He's like, okay, it's gonna take more time. I was like, all right, we've got time. This is my cat Penelope, she passed away. So I come from an interdisciplinary background. I do communications with organizing events, not as fun as this. And I work in the law, obviously, but I work with a lot of social worker professionals as well. And I think that knowing what we know is imperative to doing what we want to do better. And so having better data and having it available to everyone will make Law and policy easier. It's so much easier to make an argument to a legislator or someone you want to introduce a bill if you can say, this is what's really happening. Social care professionals, if they can understand the links between economic hardship and eventual animal cruelty and domestic violence, they can catch things before they happen, before kids are actually hurt and before more animals are hurt. Animal protection organizations and animal rights organizations. I know this session's called the welfarist regime, but there's a rights argument to be made here, because when we know where rights are being violated, where they should exist, we can make them happen better. Consumer protection networks, child advocates, blah, blah, blah. All right, why? Why do we care about this so much? It's finding culturally relevant solutions. So what works in the US doesn't work anywhere else. We're hard-headed and at times very stupid in how we do things and very ineffective. But finding culturally relevant solutions to work on issues where they exist, as they exist with the people who are there, are necessary for lasting and meaningful change. So, for example, I'm having an event in Southeast Asia, not me personally, my organization's having an event in Southeast Asia in October. And so much of that is making sure that advocates who are in Southeast Asian countries and throughout Asia can meet each other to talk about the issues that they're facing and to find common solutions, because you don't know what you don't know. And so finding these collaborative approaches, finding people, having a more developed work and support can make solving these problems better. Not to mention funding accessibility. Everyone who works in the nonprofit or academic space will eventually come up to the point where like, and where do you get your money? And answering questions from your funders on why things aren't happening quicker, why they're not happening more efficiently. Having things like data to back up the economic realities in the landscape, the cultural and socioeconomic things that are driving pervasive animal cruelty and animal rights issues can make those arguments to funders better and easier and get funders on board. Thanks, guys.